James had always dreamed of something different. Life in the United States felt like an endless loop. Wake up, work, eat, sleep, repeat. The American dream had turned into a routine of stress, high rent, and digital isolation. Working remotely, as a programmer, gave him freedom. But what was the point if he was just stuck in an expensive city, watching his savings drain away on overpriced coffee and rent that swallowed half his paycheck? That was when he discovered the Philippines. Not through travel brochures or documentaries, but through YouTube vlogs of expats living a life that seemed almost too good to be true. Crystal clear beaches, a low cost of living, welcoming locals, and of course the allure of meeting someone special. It sounded perfect, a place where he could stretch his dollar, escape the suffocating hustle, and maybe even find love. He wasn't naive enough to think it would be all paradise, but how hard could it be? The decision came fast. The more he watched, the more convinced he became. He started joining Facebook groups for expats, reading articles on visas, and mentally preparing for what felt like the boldest move of his life. The biggest draw? He wouldn't need to work as much. His remote income, modest by American standards, was more than enough to live comfortably there. That alone was enough to make him book the one-way ticket. He spent months researching. What was the best city for an expat? Should he go to Manila, Cebu, or a more laid-back province? What about crime, healthcare, dating culture? But research only went so far. He knew the real experience would start the moment he stepped off that plane. And so, he packed up, sold what he didn't need, and boarded the flight that would change everything. What was he really looking for? Escape, adventure, maybe both. He imagined a fresh start, waking up to ocean views instead of grey skyscrapers, having real human connections instead of Zoom meetings. But expectations have a funny way of setting you up for surprises, and James was about to learn that firsthand. The moment James stepped out of the airport in Manila, the first thing that hit him wasn't the excitement of a new life. It was the heat. Not just warm, not just humid, an unbearable wall of thick, suffocating air that felt like stepping into a sauna fully clothed. He had read about it, sure, but reading about heat and feeling it seep into your skin, making your shirt stick to your back within minutes, were two entirely different things. Then came the chaos. The roads outside the airport were a sea of honking cars, motorcycles weaving through traffic like it was a video game, and street vendors shouting over one another. His Uber app wouldn't work properly, so he had to take a local taxi, where the driver immediately tried to overcharge him. "Fixed price, sir," the driver said with a grin, quoting a number that James knew was more than double what it should be. Tired from the long flight and not wanting to argue, he just agreed, sinking into the sticky leather seat as the driver pulled into the madness of Manila traffic. 2 hours. That's how long it took to get from the airport to his Airbnb. 2 hours of stop-and-go movement, the smell of exhaust fumes, the occasional glance from street kids tapping on the window asking for spare change. Nothing in those YouTube vlogs had prepared him for this. Was this a mistake? The first few weeks in the Philippines were a blur of confusion, frustration, and unexpected lessons. Every day, James encountered something that reminded him how little he truly understood about the country. The language barrier wasn't just about words, it was about context. Yes, most Filipinos spoke English, but that didn't mean communication was easy. The indirect way people spoke, the constant smiling even when things were going wrong, the unspoken rules of politeness, all of it was foreign to him. One of the biggest shocks was the concept of Filipino time. Schedules here seemed to be more of a suggestion than a rule. If someone said they would meet at 3 in the afternoon, there was a good chance they wouldn't show up until 4. At first, it drove James crazy. Back home, being late was a sign of disrespect. Here, it was just part of life. Eventually, he stopped checking his watch so often. Then there was the matter of money. He had thought he was prepared for the cost of living, but he had underestimated how quickly little expenses added up. Taxi fares, convenience store snacks, tips, small service fees that seemed to appear out of nowhere. His bank account was shrinking faster than he had expected. He tried to withdraw cash from an ATM and was hit with an absurdly high foreign transaction fee. He learned the hard way that many local businesses didn't accept credit cards. Carrying cash became a necessity, and being overly trusting with prices meant getting overcharged often. Social life was another challenge. Making friends wasn't as easy as he had imagined. The Filipinos he met were friendly, but real friendships took time. Expats, on the other hand, were a mixed bag. Some had been in the country for years and had a deep respect for the culture. Others were bitter, jaded men who only seemed to complain about the Philippines while refusing to leave. James didn't want to become one of them. Dating was even more complicated. He quickly learned that dating in the Philippines wasn't like in the US. Here, relationships often moved fast, sometimes too fast. One of his first dates ended with the woman asking if he was serious about marriage. They had only been talking for a few days. Another woman brought her cousin along as a chaperone, something he hadn't even considered would be a possibility. He wasn't against serious relationships, but the cultural expectations caught him off guard. Then there was the family aspect. In the US, relationships were usually about two people. Here, they involved entire families. It wasn't uncommon for a girlfriend's relatives to ask for financial help, not out of greed, but because in Filipino culture, family was everything. Supporting each other was a way of life. To James, it felt overwhelming. He barely knew these people, yet they saw him as someone who might provide. He had to remind himself that it wasn't personal. It was just how things worked here. One night, after another long day of trying to figure things out, James sat alone in his small apartment, staring out the window at the neon lights of the city. He thought about the life he had left behind, the convenience, the predictability, the structure. Had he made a mistake? Was this too much change, too fast? But then he remembered why he had come. He hadn't wanted predictability. He had wanted something real, something different. And if he wanted to make this work, he needed to stop comparing everything to America. He needed to adapt. By the time he reached his temporary apartment, exhaustion had settled in. He collapsed onto the bed, listening to the hum of the air conditioner, working overtime. It was past midnight, but his stomach growled. He hadn't eaten anything since the airplane meal. He checked Google Maps for a nearby restaurant, found one that was supposedly open 24 hours, and decided to step out into the night. Walking through the unfamiliar streets, James felt an odd mix of excitement and unease. The city never truly slept. Small food stalls with bright fluorescent lights still had people sitting around chatting in Tagalog. A few stray dogs roamed the sidewalks. He finally found a tiny eatery, a carinderia, where a woman behind the counter greeted him with a smile. The menu was handwritten on a whiteboard, but the words were mostly in Tagalog. He pointed at something that looked like chicken and rice. "This one," he said, trying to sound confident. She nodded, scooped up a plate of food, and handed it to him. When he took the first bite, he realized it wasn't chicken. It was something chewier with a different texture. "What is this?" he asked, feeling stupid for not knowing. "Adidas," the woman said cheerfully. James frowned. Adidas. Like the shoe brand. He quickly Googled it under the table. Chicken feet. He had just bitten into a boiled, marinated chicken foot. He put down his fork. "You don't like?" the woman asked, tilting her head. He forced a smile. "It's different. Culture." Shock. That's what this was. The food, the language, the smells, the noise. It was all hitting him at once. He thought he had prepared, but preparation only went so far. Was this what life here was really going to be like? Could he handle it? He finished his meal, thanked the woman, and walked back to his apartment. The streets felt safer than he expected, but he still kept his guard up. He could already tell that being a foreigner here meant standing out. People glanced at him, not in a threatening way, just curiosity. He wasn't just another person in the crowd anymore. He was an outsider. Lying in bed that night, James couldn't sleep. Maybe it was jet lag, or maybe it was the weight of realization. The Philippines wasn't just beaches and cheap living. It was a different world entirely, and he had just stepped into it. James knew he had two choices: keep resisting or start adapting. He chose the latter. The first step was to change his approach. Instead of assuming he understood how things worked, he began asking questions. He started listening more. Instead of getting frustrated with delays, he tried to embrace the rhythm of life here. If people were late, it wasn't personal. If things moved slowly, there was no point in fighting it. He needed to learn patience. A turning point came when he met Miguel, a middle-aged Filipino who ran a small cafe near his apartment. Miguel had spent years working overseas but had returned home to start his own business. Unlike some locals who were too polite to correct him, Miguel had no problem telling James exactly what he was doing wrong. "You're thinking like an American," Miguel told him one afternoon over a cup of strong, sweet Barako coffee. "Here, things don't always make sense. You have to accept that." James took his advice seriously. He started paying attention to how Filipinos handled problems. When faced with setbacks, they didn't explode in frustration. They laughed, shrugged it off and moved on. Even in difficult situations, there was an unshakable optimism, a belief that things would work out. He also realized that to truly fit in, he needed to stop living like a tourist. He ditched the overpriced expat bars and started eating at hole-in-the-wall restaurants where locals went. He learned a few basic phrases in Tagalog, not enough to be fluent, but enough to show respect. Instead of just socializing with other foreigners, he made an effort to get to know his neighbors. Slowly, people started treating him differently. He was no longer just another outsider passing through. One of the biggest lessons came when he tried to negotiate a lower rent for his apartment. Back home, negotiating rent wasn't common, but here everything was negotiable. Miguel gave him a tip. Don't argue, don't demand, just smile and ask politely. To James's surprise, it worked. The landlord knocked down the price without hesitation. Even dating became easier once he stopped applying American logic to Filipino relationships. He learned that directness wasn't always the best approach. Filipino culture valued subtlety, patience, and respect for family traditions. When he stopped treating dates like casual meetups and started genuinely engaging with people, he found deeper connections. One evening, as he sat on the beach watching the sunset, he realized how much he had changed. A few months ago, he would have been checking his phone, planning his next move, trying to control everything. Now he just sat there, appreciating the moment. For the first time, he wasn't trying to force life to fit into his expectations. He was simply living it. James had reached a point where the Philippines no longer felt like a temporary escape, but a place where he could truly exist. Yet, with this newfound sense of belonging came an important realization. Adapting wasn't the same as losing himself. He didn't need to become someone else to fit in. He just needed to find balance. One of the hardest lessons came when a local friend asked to borrow money. Not much, just enough to cover a family emergency. At first, James didn't think much of it. He had heard stories from other expats about being seen as a walking ATM, but this was different. Or so he thought. He lent the money, expecting it back eventually. Days turned into weeks, then months. The repayment never came. Instead, his friend slowly disappeared, avoiding messages and making excuses. It wasn't about the money. It was about trust. It was a painful but necessary wake-up call. Miguel's words echoed in his mind. Not everyone who smiles at you is your friend. It wasn't bitterness he felt, but understanding. Filipinos were kind, generous, and welcoming. But they also lived in a system where survival often depended on asking for help. Some saw foreigners as a lifeline, not out of malice but out of necessity. James learned to be cautious without becoming cynical. He continued to help when he could, but with clearer boundaries. He realized that being part of a community didn't mean saying yes to everything. It meant knowing when to say no. Professionally, he found new opportunities. He had been living off his remote job, but through networking, he stumbled into freelance gigs helping local businesses with their websites. It wasn't much, but it gave him a deeper connection to the people around him. He was no longer just an observer. He was contributing, and then there was love. Not the instant romance he had imagined when he first arrived, but something slower, more genuine. He met Liana through mutual friends. She wasn't like the women who had asked about marriage on the first date or those who seemed more interested in what he could provide than in who he was. Liana was independent, smart, and had no interest in chasing a foreigner's money. Their relationship grew naturally, without pressure. She taught him more about the culture than any book or blog ever could. One evening they walked through a night market, weaving between food stalls filled with sizzling skewers, steaming bowls of noodles, and vendors shouting out deals. James watched as Liana haggled with a vendor, her playful smile making the whole interaction seem like a game rather than a negotiation. He had once found these markets overwhelming, too loud, too chaotic. Now he saw them as vibrant, full of life. As they sat down to eat, Liana asked, "Do you ever think about going back?" James hesitated. He had asked himself the same question many times. Would he ever return to the US? Maybe, maybe not. But right now he didn't feel the need to. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I'm not in a rush to leave." Liana smiled, handing him a skewer of grilled pork. "Good, because I wasn't planning on letting you go so easily." For the first time since arriving, James didn't feel like a foreigner. He wasn't just visiting, observing, or adapting. He was living, and that, more than anything, made the journey worth it. Months passed, and James no longer felt like the outsider who had stepped off a plane, overwhelmed by the heat and chaos of Manila. He had settled into a rhythm, a life that felt both foreign and familiar. He had stopped resisting the differences, and in return, the Philippines had embraced him in ways he never expected. But there was still one question he couldn't shake. Was this truly home? One evening he sat at a quiet beachside cafe, watching the waves roll in, the city noise, the crowded streets, the endless honking of jeepneys. None of that mattered. Here. The Philippines had a way of balancing chaos with serenity. Liana sat across from him, stirring the ice in her drink, studying his face. "You're thinking about something," she said. James sighed. "I've been here for a while now, long enough to stop feeling like a tourist, but sometimes I wonder, is this it? Is this where I'm supposed to be?" Liana tilted her head, considering his words. "Does it have to be?" He frowned. "What do you mean?" She smiled. "Life isn't about finding one place and staying there forever. It's about choosing where you feel most alive." That hit him harder than he expected. Back in the US, he had felt trapped, going through the motions without truly living. Here he had struggled, adapted, grown. Maybe that was the point. Not to find one perfect place, but to experience life fully, wherever that took him. A few weeks later, he booked a flight back to the US. Not to leave forever, but to visit, to see his family, to reconnect with the person he had been before this journey. The old James wouldn't have imagined coming back on his own terms. But he wasn't the old James anymore. As he boarded the plane, he looked at Liana, who had come to see him off. "I'll be back," he promised. She laughed. "I know. The Philippines has a way of calling people back." And deep down, James knew she was right.